Anytime now, the president is set to address reporters alongside France's President Emmanuel Macron. NBC's Hallie Jackson is at the press conference site in Saint-Jean-de-Luz, France. Also with me, once again, Ambassador Chris Hill, Michael Steele, Insana, and Jason Johnson is joining us, the politics editor at TheRoot.com. So, Hallie, take us there, please. What's going on?
Yeah. Well, we're hanging out at this auditorium, Chris, waiting for President Trump and President Macron to begin their news conference set to start in just a little bit. And boy, is there plenty to talk with the president about. A litany of headlines that have emerged this morning, given the president's meetings here at the G7. He's already done extensive Q&A sessions with reporters. Local time here, it's late in the afternoon. I know it's morning where you are. But key among these topics are the president's positions. And they have been shifting positions here, it has seemed, from this White House on China trade talks. The president sounded the most optimistic he has been yet, saying he believes they are in a much better position, the U.S. is, when it comes to those negotiations than they have been so far. And that is based on some interactions that he's had, that China has reached out to U.S. officials on over the last maybe 12, 15 hours or so. Treasury Secretary Mnuchin also insists that this outreach has been productive, although I have to say, Chris, the Chinese have not confirmed those calls to the U.S. at this point, and it's really not clear what Beijing is willing to concede on these negotiations, if it's going to be what President Trump wants. But we will acknowledge he is sounding this note of optimism just 24 hours after he was asked if he had any second thoughts about the China trade war. The president said he did. The White House later clarified, you could say, saying that the remarks were misinterpreted and that the only regrets the president had, if he had any at all, was not actually being tougher on those Chinese tariffs. There's a lot to sort through when it comes to the status of those talks. I know the markets are watching very closely here to see what the president has to say. The other big issue, of course, is Iran and that surprise summit guest that arrived here in France over the weekend, the Iranian Foreign Minister Javad Zarif. President Trump says that President Macron asked his permission before Zarif was invited. The French president has not confirmed that piece of it yet, so that's another question that I think folks in this room will have once we do see President Macron. The issue of where the G7 stands on Iran, President Trump says that there is great unity among leaders here. He hinted at a possible joint statement to come later today. We haven't seen it yet, but that's something we're watching for, Chris. And let me just make two other quick points here. On climate, the president did not attend a working session on that earlier in the day, with that being, of course, a key issue for the host here, Emmanuel Macron. The White House says that a senior official attended in the president's absence since he had meetings with other world leaders, although those other world leaders managed to make it to at least part of the session before going off and meeting with the president. The leaders here did agree to fund $20 million to fight those massive wildfires burning in the Amazon right now. As for next year, let's look ahead just briefly. The president hinted at maybe Miami, Chris. You know the U.S. is hosting, so that means that the G7 comes over to our neck of the woods next year. The president, without definitively saying he wanted it at his golf resort, Trump Doral, just close to the Miami airport there, certainly suggested it. He talked about how spacious it was, room for all the delegation members, close to the airport, good proximity. If this actually comes to fruition, Chris, and the president does select that property to host the G7, it would be, to say the least, very controversial, given that the president still has a financial stake in that property, and it's sure to raise some conflict of interest questions. Yes. So plenty on the plate here at the G7, Chris. He actually heads home right after the news conference, so he'll be back where you are by the time evening falls tonight.
So, Ambassador, Hallie just laid out very well a whole host of questions that not just the press has, but I think a lot of people have, whether it is from the president or from President Macron. What would you most like some clarity on about what happened over the last 3 days?
Well, certainly, I'd like some clarity on how he sees the way forward on China, because if he answers in some kind of pugnacious way to the effect that we should have had even more tariffs, I mean, that will start affecting, well, it's already affecting how this economy operates, and he knows that if this economy goes down, he is not going to be reelected. So I think he'll want to keep this kind of positive vibe that he suggested earlier, but I think he needs to keep it in the reality of things that have actually happened, because the Chinese spokesman said, I don't know of any phone calls. So I'm going to look very carefully at the comments on China. I don't think he'll be asked about Russia's participation in a future G8, but that would also be an interesting comment, because that was another area where he was completely out of sync with the other members. And of course, why in the world would he just skip entirely a climate meeting whose purpose was to deal with fires in the Amazon rainforest, for heaven's sakes. And I think he ought to try to kind of tamp down this kind of a Luddite notion of what's going on in the climate. So we'll have to see how he handles this.
But I mean, really, are you surprised he pulled out of the Paris Climate Accords? I mean, if he was going to skip something, I guess we're not surprised it's that, right?
Yeah, but I mean, the upshot of it was to provide money to help fight the fire. And what, we're not going to participate in that? We don't care about forest fires now? Is that our new position? So I think he needs to be a little careful on kind of needless irritations of that kind. I think he'll get away with basically his exaggeration of what's been done with Japan. But again, I think he's got to kind of show that he's, with us in the rest of the world and didn't come from some other planet, which is beginning to be what people are concerned about.
And Jason, I think that the Atlanta summed up a lot of his critics as they watch what's happened just over the course of these 3 days. They wrote, Trump's narrative encapsulates a larger problem. Whether he can be taken at face value, means what he says, and knows his own mind.
Chris, he can't, right? That's why these things don't matter as much. You can't trust anything Donald Trump says, not because I think he's intentionally lying, but because he's convinced by the last person he talked to in the room, right? Whether you're talking about gun control, whether you're talking about the environment or anything else like that. And I agree with former Ambassador Hill. We're giving $20 million? $20 million, that's all we're giving to basically the global CPAC, the global air filter, which is the Amazon. That's
20%.
20%. I mean, it's absolutely insane. So I don't think the president can be trusted on much. I think these press conferences are often an opportunity for him to perform and feel as if he is on the same stage with other world leaders we consider to be incompetent, but we won't get much from this. The work actually ends up being done by officials in Washington, D.C. when they have to clean up for what the president says and then figure out what we're actually going to do.
So, Ron, let's take look one more time at what the markets are doing here. And is this kind of baked in now where we are with China, or could the president say something over the course of however long this press conference goes on that could move these numbers, which are now up about 237?
Yeah, he could easily move the market again by saying either that he had another conversation that included President Xi and he is committed to cutting a deal. That would certainly move the market higher. We're just off the highs, Chris. We're up about 300 points a little earlier, which is half of what was lost on Friday. Or he could say that, listen, we're not making any headway, and that would send the market in a different direction. So this market is vulnerable to every tweet, every comment, and that's the way life is now with respect to how the markets behave. The bigger picture, as the ambassador was saying, is how this affects the economy. Right now, the tariffs that are in place are costing every American household a little over $700. That could go to $1,000 if they were fully implemented, and even higher if the president were to raise tariffs not only on Chinese products, but European and Japanese cars. Cars were excluded, by the way, in the conversation that he had with Prime Minister Abe. So all of that's still out there, and we don't have an all-clear signal in the markets by any stretch of the imagination. And you could see that by the market just getting back now about a third of what was lost on Friday. So it's a wait and see until he speaks again.
There was some pushback, Michael, after these meetings. I mean, for example, when you saw China putting out the word, no, that press conference or that phone call didn't happen, or Boris Johnson, although he was a little tepid, he made it clear that he's for peaceful trade negotiations, not for a trade war. But given that, was this just diplomacy, or was it a missed opportunity for the rest of the world to more aggressively challenge the president?
I think the rest of the world has decided, and you can say that they're right or wrong, that aggressively, publicly challenging the president is counterproductive, that you can make some progress with him, or at least the appearance of some progress in behind-the-scenes conversations. I think the bigger picture here is that Ambassador Hill is exactly correct. The linchpin of the president's reelection is the economy. Climate change is an important issue. Iran is an important issue. There are things the president has done that are supported by parts of the base of the Republican Party, increasing the military, conservative justices, moving the embassy to Jerusalem. But if you're going to win swing voters, if he's going to get the votes he needs to get that electoral majority again, it's going to have to depend on a continued strong economic growth and low unemployment. And this back and forth with China is a huge threat to that.
We'll see what he says when he comes to the microphones. Michael Steele, thank you. Hallie Jackson, Ambassador Christopher Hill, Ron Insana, and Jason Johnson. Much appreciated, all of you. But coming up, members of the G